She shoved him with both hands. Sawyer Creed hit the railing, tipped backward, and dropped into the black water off the stern of the Prescott Maritime yacht. The crew froze. No one moved. No one called out. 15 seconds of nothing but the slap of waves against the hull. Then he surfaced. One hand gripped the swim platform. The other held something above the waterline, a rectangular box, International Rescue Orange beneath 2 years of barnacles and sea growth. The engraving was still legible. Prescott Maritime Tail Number 917 R-Piece. Camille Prescott's lips parted. Her feet did not move. She knew that tail number the way she knew her own name. 72 hours earlier, the Beaufort harbor smelled like diesel fuel and salt. Sawyer Creed was elbow-deep in the engine compartment of a 30-year-old shrimp trawler named the Ruth Ann, replacing a corroded fuel injector with hands that knew the work without his eyes. He earned day wages at the marina, enough to cover rent on the small clapboard house 3 minutes walk from the docks, enough to keep the lights on and the fridge stocked for 2. That was the math, and he didn't need it to add up to anything more. Emmy came out the back door at 7:15, with her backpack slung over one shoulder and a rolled sheet of paper in her fist. She was 8 and had her mother's jawline and her father's habit of not saying much until she had something worth saying. This morning, she had something. She unrolled the paper across the engine cowling, smearing it with a thumbprint of grease, and presented her latest creation, a hand-drawn nautical chart of the Beaufort Inlet, complete with depth soundings she had invented, and a compass rose that pointed in 5 directions instead of 4. Sawyer wiped his hands on a rag and studied the chart with the seriousness of a man reviewing classified intelligence. He traced a finger along the channel she had drawn between Shackleford Banks and Carrot Island, and told her the draft was too shallow for anything bigger than a kayak. Emmy informed him that the channel was for mermaids, not boats. He conceded the point. She folded the chart, kissed him on the cheek, and walked to the bus stop at the end of the dock road. He watched her until she turned the corner. Then he went back to the fuel injector. By 9, the harbormaster found him. There was a job on the Prescott Maritime Yacht, a 160-foot motor vessel moored at the Deepwater Pier for a corporate fundraiser that evening. The ballast pump system had a fault, and the yacht's regular engineer was in Charleston. The pay was 4 times Sawyer's daily rate. He said he'd take a look. The yacht was a different country. Sawyer climbed the service gangway in steel-toed boots that left black marks on teak decking polished to the color of honey. He kept his head down, moved through the service corridors to the engine room, and started pulling panels. The ballast pump's control board had a burned relay $15 part, 40 minutes of work. He didn't need to go above the waterline for any of it. Camille Prescott arrived by helicopter at noon. Sawyer heard the rotors from 3 decks below, felt the vibration settle into the hull. Through a service hatch he caught fragments, heels on teak, a woman's voice giving instructions that sounded less like requests and more like verdicts. She moved through the yacht the way a surgeon moves through an operating room, checking every surface, every arrangement, every angle of every flower on every table. She found him 20 minutes later. Or rather, she found the fact of him a stranger aboard her vessel, unbriefed and unauthorized. She asked the harbormaster's liaison, who had approved outside personnel. Sawyer looked up from the relay panel, and for a moment they simply regarded each other across the engine room hatch. Her eyes were the pale gray of a winter sea, and they carried the same temperature. She told him to finish by 5 o'clock. She told him he was not to set foot on the main deck. She did not ask his name. Sawyer nodded once and went back to the relay. But he noticed things. The way her fingers curled into her palm when someone mentioned the fundraiser's dedication to her father's memory. The way she touched the bulkhead as she walked, as though confirming the vessel was still solid beneath her hand. She controlled everything within reach, and it struck him that this was not authority, it was fear dressed in competence. She was afraid of losing one more thing. That evening the yacht glowed. 200 guests filled the upper decks, crystal catching the harbor lights, laughter carrying across the water to where the shrimp boats sat dark and quiet. Sawyer was still below, finishing the ballast system's secondary valve alignment work he could have left for morning, but chose not to. He preferred the engine room to whatever was happening above. Then he heard voices through the ventilation duct. Not the polished murmur of cocktail conversation, something harder. Camille's voice, controlled, but thin at the edges. And a man's voice, older, unhurried, carrying the particular calm of someone who did not need to raise his tone to make a threat land. The man was Victor Stroud. Sawyer did not know the name yet, but he knew the cadence, the slow phrasing of someone accustomed to having his suggestions treated as instructions. Stroud was pressing Camille to sign a proxy vote ahead of next week's board meeting. She refused. He pressed again. The third time, he simply observed that boards had options when leadership became emotional, and that Raymond would have understood the wisdom of stepping aside. Camille told him to leave her yacht. The conversation ended with a door closing, not slamming. Men like Stroud did not slam doors. Sawyer finished the valve alignment and began packing his tools. His route to the service gangway took him through a lower corridor he hadn't used before, the private section near the owner's quarters. Raymond Prescott's stateroom. The door was locked, sealed since his death 2 years earlier, according to the brass placard mounted beside the frame. But the lock plate bore fresh scratches, bright metal against aged brass. Someone had tried to force it recently. Someone with a pry tool and not much patience. Sawyer stopped. He looked both ways down the corridor. The engine room was behind him. The gangway was ahead. This was not his door, not his ship, not his concern. He was still standing there when the yacht's head of security rounded the corner. The man was in his 50s, built like a retired master chief, which is exactly what he turned out to be. He asked Sawyer for identification. Sawyer gave him his driver's license. The security chief ran the name through a tablet linked to a federal database, and his posture changed. His shoulders squared. His chin lifted a half-inch. The screen showed what the harbor knew nothing about. Sawyer Creed, former SEAL Team 4, explosive ordnance disposal, and underwater salvage. Service record classified above the security chief's clearance level. The old master chief looked at Sawyer with the expression of a man who had just found a 4-star general fixing a toilet. Sawyer asked him quietly not to mention it to anyone. The security chief nodded. Some requests did not require rank to be honored. Sawyer stood in that corridor after the man left. The scratched lock, the sealed stateroom, the argument he'd overheard, none of it was his business. But 12 years in the Navy had taught him that damaged locks meant someone else had already decided to look. He thought about Meredith, his wife. The phone call from Bethesda while he was on deployment in the South China Sea Stage 4 progressed faster than anyone expected. He requested emergency leave. It took 4 days to extract from the operational zone. When he walked into the hospital room, Emmy was sitting on the bed next to her mother, holding a crayon in one hand and Meredith's fingers in the other. Meredith had been gone for 6 hours. Emmy was 5 years old and had not let go. That was the day Sawyer left the Navy. He swore he would never again be somewhere else when it mattered. He checked the stateroom door. It gave. Inside, the room was untouched except for one detail, a desk drawer, open, with several files missing. But wedged in the back of the drawer, overlooked, was a single sheet of paper in Raymond Prescott's handwriting. GPS coordinates off the Outer Banks, and below them, 7 words: verify independently, trust no one on the board. Sawyer folded the paper and put it in his pocket. The old instinct was already moving. The next morning, Sawyer sat at his kitchen table with a nautical chart spread over Emmy's cereal bowls. The coordinates from Raymond's note placed a point in the Atlantic, roughly 14 nautical miles off Cape Hatteras, close to the official crash site of Raymond Prescott's Beechcraft King Air, but offset by approximately 2 nautical miles to the southeast. The official search grid, the one published in the NTSB preliminary report, did not include this position. The recovery teams had looked in the wrong place, or they had been told to. Sawyer stared at the chart. He had no stake in this. He was a dock mechanic in a small town, raising a daughter, fixing engines. The Prescott family's tragedy was not his to investigate, but 2 nautical miles was not a rounding error. 2 nautical miles, in open water with known currents and a documented radar track, was a deliberate misdirection. Someone had fed false coordinates to the search teams, someone who understood maritime salvage well enough to know that a 2-mile offset in that particular stretch of the Atlantic, with its shifting sandbars and strong lateral currents, would make recovery virtually impossible. He knew he would go. One dive, just to look. 5 miles away, Camille sat in the Beaufort satellite office of Prescott Maritime Holdings, watching the morning light move across a framed photograph of her father on the credenza. Raymond at the helm of the original Prescott vessel, grinning into a crosswind, his hair blown sideways. She had inherited his company, his board, his enemies, and his chair. She had not inherited his certainty. Stroud had consolidated 7 votes on a 12-member board. The no-confidence motion was scheduled for the following week. She was going to lose the company her father built from a single cargo barge in Morehead City. She stood alone in that office for a long time, one hand gripping the back of her father's chair, knuckles white, face still. She did not cry. Crying was a thing she had stopped permitting herself the day she accepted the CEO title, because the board was watching, because Stroud was watching, because the world her father had built required a version of her that did not have time to grieve. She returned to the yacht that afternoon to retrieve documents from Raymond's stateroom and found the door unlocked, the drawer open, files missing. Her mind went immediately to the only outsider who had been aboard the previous night. The mechanic, the quiet man with the grease-stained hands who had looked at her without flinching. She found Sawyer at the marina, kneeling beside a crab trap with a splicing needle in his teeth. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her tone carried the focused precision of someone accustomed to firing people in boardrooms. She asked him what he had taken from her father's stateroom. Sawyer removed the needle from his teeth. He looked up at her, the same level gaze from the engine room hatch, the same unhurried calm, and said, "I didn't take anything from that room, but someone did." Camille paused, not because she believed him, because he wasn't afraid of her. Everyone in her orbit was afraid of her, or performing a careful imitation of not being afraid. This man was simply answering a question. She left without another word, but she did not call the police, and she did not mention the conversation to Stroud. She could not have explained why. Sawyer borrowed a dry suit, a single tank, and a dive light from a retired charter captain who owed him 3 engine rebuilds. He launched from a rented skiff before dawn, running southeast from Beaufort Inlet, toward the coordinates on Raymond's note. The ocean off Cape Hatteras in the early morning was a cathedral of green and black visibility, dropped to 12 feet below 30 meters. The current pulled south at nearly 2 knots, and the bottom was a graveyard of sand and shipwrecked timber. He found the wreckage at 67 feet. The Beechcraft had broken apart on impact, scattering aluminum and instrument panels across a debris field the size of a basketball court. Sand had buried most of it, but the aft fuselage section was intact, wedged against a rock ledge, and bolted to its frame was the flight data recorder, the black box, still sealed in its protective housing, encrusted with barnacles and waving ribbons of seagrass. No one had touched it. No recovery team had ever reached this spot. Sawyer cut the mounting bolts and brought it to the surface. On the skiff, dripping salt water onto the aluminum bench, he turned the housing over in his hands. The NTSB tamper seal, the adhesive strip that federal investigators applied to every recovered flight recorder to certify chain of custody, was absent. Not broken, not degraded, simply never applied. The official investigation had never reached this wreckage. The coordinates given to the search teams had been wrong, and no one had corrected them. Meanwhile, on the yacht, Camille was preparing for the board meeting. Stroud appeared in the main salon, impeccable in a navy blazer, holding a glass of sparkling water as though it were a scepter. He suggested, with the warmth of a physician delivering a terminal diagnosis, that she consider resigning voluntarily. To preserve the family's dignity, to honor her father's legacy by stepping aside gracefully, rather than being removed. Camille told him her father's legacy was not his to define. Stroud set down the glass. "Your father trusted me more than anyone, Camille. Don't make me prove that." She watched him leave the salon. The threat was not in the words, it was in the certainty behind them. Stroud did not make promises he couldn't keep. Sawyer returned to the yacht 40 minutes later. He came up the service gangway carrying the dive bag, wet suit draped over his shoulder, still smelling of salt and neoprene. He needed to find Camille. He needed to show her what her father had hidden in coordinates no one was supposed to find. He made it to the main deck corridor before she saw him. From the upper observation deck, Camille looked down and saw the mechanic, the man she had accused that morning, standing in a restricted area of her vessel, carrying diving equipment, dripping seawater onto her father's deck. Every suspicion she had assembled in the last 24 hours locked into a single conclusion: he was looting the family's property. diving on their wreckage, taking what didn't belong to him. She came down the stairs fast. She crossed the deck in 4 strides, and she pushed him, both hands against his chest, hard enough to send him over the low stern railing and into the harbor below. The crew stared. Camille stared at her own hands. Then Sawyer surfaced, and in his raised hand, barnacle-crusted and unmistakable, was the flight data recorder bearing her father's tail number, the box that 2 years of official investigation had never found. The answers she had stopped believing existed, held above the waterline by the man she had just thrown into the sea. Camille's hand found the railing. Her legs did not move. 2 years of questions, 2 years of the official narrative mechanical failure, pilot error, case closed, and the truth had been sitting on the ocean floor 2 miles from where everyone had been told to look. They pulled Sawyer aboard. He didn't say anything. He set the flight data recorder on the deck between them and let it speak for itself. In Raymond's stateroom, with the door locked and the curtains drawn, Sawyer laid out everything. The handwritten note with the GPS coordinates, the offset from the official search grid, the missing NTSB tamper seal, the fact that no federal investigator had ever reached the actual wreckage site, which meant someone had provided false coordinates to the recovery teams before the search even began. Camille processed it the way she processed everything, methodically, sequentially, without visible emotion. But her hands betrayed her. When she reached out to touch the flight data recorder, her fingers trembled against the barnacled surface. She pulled them back, touched it again, held on. Sawyer did not comfort her. He did not offer words or explanations or theories about what the data might contain. He stood on the far side of the stateroom and gave her the space to absorb what this meant, that her father's death might not have been an accident, that someone inside the company, someone on the board, someone she trusted, might have arranged for the search to fail. She asked him why. Why dive? Why look? Why any of it? He told her about the note, about the scratched lock, about the instinct that wouldn't let him walk past a sealed door that someone else had already tried to open. She studied his face. "Who are you, really?" He met her eyes. "Someone who knows what a tampered seal looks like." Her phone buzzed. Stroud's name on the screen. His voice, pleasant and controlled, asking why the yacht hadn't departed the harbor yet, suggesting that the crew seemed behind schedule. She answered in clipped sentences and hung up. The call told her something she had suspected, but not confirmed. Stroud was tracking her movements. Every decision, every delay, every deviation from the expected pattern. She made a choice. She would not call the police. Not yet. She did not know how far Stroud's connections extended into the Coast Guard, into the NTSB regional office, into the Beaufort Police Department. If he had the reach to misdirect a federal crash investigation, he had the reach to bury a local complaint. She looked at Sawyer. "Can you keep this safe?" He understood. She was asking him to hold the only piece of physical evidence that might prove her father was murdered, asking a man she had pushed off her yacht an hour ago. "If we do this," he said, "we do it right. I know people who can read what's on this box without anyone knowing." She nodded. It was not trust, not yet. It was the recognition that she had no one else, and that this man, for reasons she could not yet understand, had risked his life to bring her the truth without asking for anything in return. Sawyer made the call from a payphone outside the Beaufort post office at 11 that night. The man on the other end was Decker, a former Navy aviation systems engineer who now ran a private crash analysis lab in Norfolk, Virginia. They had served together. Decker didn't ask unnecessary questions. Sawyer told him he was sending a flight data recorder via bonded courier. Chain of custody documented, no digital trail. Decker said he'd have preliminary results in 72 hours. While Sawyer arranged the transfer, Camille was doing her own excavation. She sat in the Prescott Maritime Archives until 2 in the morning, pulling board minutes from the months surrounding her father's death. The pattern emerged slowly. Victor Stroud had proposed hiring Meridian Aviation Consultants to lead the crash investigation, a firm that, according to its SEC filings, listed Stroud as a minority stakeholder through a Delaware holding company. The board had approved unanimously. Camille had voted yes. She remembered Stroud's hand on her shoulder at that meeting, his voice gentle, telling her he would handle everything. The circle was closing. The man who had selected the investigation firm owned part of the investigation firm. The investigation had produced the coordinates. The coordinates were wrong. The following evening, Camille drove to Sawyer's house to discuss next steps. It was a small place, white clapboard, blue shutters, a porch that needed painting. She knocked, and when the door opened, it was not Sawyer standing there. It was Emmy, barefoot, holding a colored pencil in one hand and a sheet of paper in the other. Emmy looked up at Camille with the frank appraisal of a child who had not yet learned to pretend. She held up the paper, another nautical chart, this one of an imaginary archipelago with trade routes and a sea monster in the corner. Camille crouched to look. She pointed to one of the islands and asked its name. Emmy said it didn't have one yet. Camille suggested something, and Emmy considered it with the gravity of a cartographer. She nodded and wrote it down. Sawyer appeared in the kitchen doorway. He watched them, his daughter, and this woman who controlled a shipping empire, sitting cross-legged on his living room floor, debating island names. Something moved across his face that he hadn't expected and didn't try to name. The knock came at 9:30. Dennis Harlow stood on the porch, 63, silver-haired, wearing a rumpled suit that suggested he had driven straight from Raleigh. He asked for Sawyer by name. The yacht's security chief had contacted him through a back channel. Harlow had been Raymond Prescott's personal attorney for 25 years. He sat at the kitchen table after Emmy had gone to bed. Camille sat across from him. Sawyer leaned against the counter. Harlow told them about the phone call. The night before Raymond's final flight, Raymond had called him at home. Late past 11, he had evidence that Stroud was siphoning funds through shell contracts. He planned to demand Stroud's removal at the next board meeting, and then Raymond said something that Harlow had carried for 2 years like a stone in his chest. "Victor threatened me, Dennis, not in so many words, but I know what he meant." Harlow had recorded the call, a habit from decades of legal work. The recording sat on a flash drive in a safety deposit box in Raleigh. He had wanted to come forward after the crash, but Stroud's attorneys contacted him within days. Not a subpoena, a warning. Defamation suit. References to Harlow's family. "I failed Raymond," Harlow said. His hands were flat on the table. "But if that box says what I think it says, I won't fail his daughter." He placed the flash drive on the table. Camille stared at it. Then Sawyer plugged it into a laptop, and Raymond Prescott's voice filled the kitchen, measured, tired, unmistakably alive. 2 years since she had heard her father speak. Camille turned her face toward the window. Her jaw tightened. She did not make a sound. Sawyer rested his hand on the back of her chair, not on her shoulder, not on her arm, on the chair, close enough to be felt, far enough to be chosen. 3 pieces. The handwritten coordinates, the flight data recorder, the recording of a dead man naming his killer. The results from Norfolk arrived by secure courier on a Tuesday morning. Decker had included a 12-page technical summary, but the critical findings fit on a single sheet. Engine number 2 had suffered a catastrophic fuel pressure loss at 4,000 feet, not a gradual degradation consistent with mechanical wear, but an instantaneous drop consistent with a blocked fuel line. Chemical analysis of residue found inside the fuel metering valve revealed traces of a chloride-based corrosive compound, industrial grade, not naturally occurring, introduced into the fuel system prior to departure. The compound was designed to degrade at operating temperature, meaning it would have been undetectable in a pre-flight inspection, but would activate within 30 minutes of engine start. The conclusion was one word: sabotage. Sawyer presented the findings in Raymond's stateroom on the yacht. Camille read the report twice. She set it down on the desk and stared at the wall for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was quiet and very even. "He called Stroud uncle. I called Stroud uncle. For 30 years, it was not a cry. It was not an accusation. It was the sound of a foundation cracking, the quiet collapse of 3 decades of trust in a man she had seated at Thanksgiving tables, who had held her when her father's casket was lowered, who had told her she was strong enough to lead the company, the man who had made sure her father's plane would never be found. Stroud moved fast. Word had reached him through a contact at the marina the mechanic had been diving, had brought something aboard the yacht, and Camille had gone quiet. Stroud did not know exactly what had been recovered, but he understood the danger of variables he could not control. Within 24 hours, he convened an emergency board meeting 48 hours out, with a motion for a vote of no confidence in Camille's leadership. His weapon was a set of financial documents, carefully fabricated, showing a pattern of unauthorized transfers from Prescott Maritime's operating accounts to a personal investment fund in Camille's name. The documents were convincing. They would not survive a forensic audit. But Stroud did not need them to survive. He needed them to last long enough for a vote. Sawyer proposed the strategy that night. Do not go to the police. Not before the board meeting. Stroud had 2 years of connections protecting him, relationships with regulators, with investigators, with local law enforcement. A police report would trigger a slow process that Stroud could delay, redirect, or bury. But a board meeting was a closed room with 12 people who had fiduciary obligations. Present the evidence there, in front of witnesses who could not look away, before Stroud had time to control the narrative. Camille agreed. They worked through the night in Raymond's stateroom. Sawyer organized the technical evidence, the flight data, the chemical analysis, the coordinate discrepancy, the missing NTSB seal. Camille prepared the financial rebuttal, cross-referencing Stroud's fabricated documents against the independent audit trail. At 3 in the morning, she fell asleep at the desk, her head resting on a stack of board minutes from 2 years ago. Sawyer took his jacket from the back of his chair and laid it across her shoulders without waking her. Then he sat down in the chair opposite and continued working. The ship was quiet. The harbor was dark. There was nothing to say that the silence did not already hold. The boardroom at Prescott Maritime's Beaufort headquarters had floor-to-ceiling windows facing the harbor. 12 chairs around a mahogany table. Stroud sat at the head, a position that was not officially his, but that no one had challenged in months. He was composed, unhurried, wearing the expression of a man who had already counted his votes. He presented the financial documents first. Methodical, precise, devastating. Unauthorized transfers totaling $4.2 million. Account numbers. Dates, signatures that appeared to be Camille's. He recommended, with visible reluctance, that the board exercise its fiduciary duty and remove the current CEO, pending a full investigation. Camille stood. She did not raise her voice. She opened a binder and walked the board through the independent audit line by line, account by account, demonstrating that every transaction Stroud had cited either did not exist in the company's verified ledger or had been altered from its original form. She showed the metadata from the forged documents, creation dates that postdated the transactions they described, author fields traced to a workstation in Stroud's office suite. Then she introduced Sawyer, not as a dock mechanic, not as the man who fixed the ballast pump. She introduced him as a former specialist in the United States Navy's underwater salvage and explosive ordnance disposal program, a man whose security clearance exceeded that of anyone else in the room. Stroud's expression shifted, not dramatically, a tightening around the eyes, a stillness in his hands that had not been there before. Sawyer stood at the front of the room and laid out the evidence. The flight data recorder, recovered from a position 2 nautical miles southeast of the official search grid, the absent NTSB tamper seal, proving no federal investigator had ever reached the actual crash site, the chemical analysis from a certified forensic aviation laboratory in Norfolk, confirming the presence of an industrial corrosive in the fuel metering valve, and the connection between Stroud and Meridian Aviation Consultants, the firm he had personally recommended to lead the investigation, the firm in which he held a financial stake, the firm that had provided the coordinates that sent every search team to the wrong location. The room was silent. 12 people staring at evidence that could not be argued away with a better presentation or a louder voice. Then the door opened. Dennis Harlow walked in carrying a laptop and a single flash drive. He plugged it in without introduction, and Raymond Prescott's voice filled the boardroom, tired, precise, unmistakable. "Victor threatened me, Dennis. If something happens to me, don't let him near my daughter's company." No one moved. The recording played for 47 seconds. When it ended, the silence was absolute. Stroud stood. He began to speak denial, indignation, the vocabulary of a man who had spent a lifetime controlling rooms exactly like this one. But the evidence was layered too deep, technical, financial, testimonial. Each piece confirmed the others. 2 board members who had committed their votes to Stroud pulled their proxies. A third pushed back from the table and would not look at him. Stroud moved toward the door. He adjusted his cuffs. He maintained the posture of a man leaving on his own terms. The 2 FBI agents were waiting in the hallway. Sawyer had contacted them through a military intelligence liaison 48 hours earlier, enough time for a federal judge to review the evidence and issue a material witness warrant. Stroud saw the badges and stopped walking. For the first time, there was nothing composed about his face. Camille watched from the boardroom doorway as they led him down the corridor. Victor Stroud. Uncle Victor. The man who had carried her on his shoulders at company picnics when she was 6. The man who had murdered her father and then held her hand at the funeral. She did not look away until he was gone. 2 weeks later, the federal indictment was unsealed. Victor Stroud was charged with first-degree murder, securities fraud, and conspiracy to obstruct a federal transportation safety investigation. Meridian Aviation Consultants was placed under investigation. 3 additional Prescott Maritime board members were subpoenaed for testimony regarding their knowledge of Stroud's financial arrangements. Camille was reconfirmed as CEO by a unanimous vote of the reconstituted board. She drove to the Beaufort Marina on a Thursday afternoon. The sun was low, throwing long shadows across the dock planks. Sawyer was where she had first found him, or rather, where he had always been, kneeling beside the engine compartment of the Ruth Ann, a wrench in one hand and a shop rag draped over his shoulder. The same man, the same position, the same grease-darkened hands. The difference was her. The last time she had stood on this dock looking at him, she had demanded to know what he had stolen. Now she stood 10 feet away and waited for him to look up. He did. He wiped his hands. He asked how the board meeting had gone, the formal one, the reconfirmation vote. She told him it was unanimous. He nodded like she had told him the weather. They talked about small things. He asked if the yacht's ballast pump was still holding. She laughed a short, surprised sound as though she had forgotten she could. She asked about Emmy. He said Emmy had finished her latest nautical chart and had added a new island. Camille asked its name. Emmy answered that question herself. She came running down the dock from the school bus stop, backpack bouncing, and spotted Camille before Sawyer could say a word. She called out and grabbed Camille's hand and pulled her to the edge of the dock to see the chart, still damp from the colored pencils. The new island sat in the northeast corner of Emmy's imaginary archipelago, carefully labeled in a child's block letters, Prescott Island. Camille looked at Sawyer. He shrugged, the corners of his eyes creasing in a way that was not quite a smile but was close enough. She offered him a position. Director of Maritime Security for Prescott Maritime Holdings, a title, an office, a salary that would have made the harbor's entire fleet of day-wage mechanics quit on the spot. He declined, gently, without hesitation, without apology. That's not my world, Camille. She was not surprised. She had known the answer before she asked. But she had needed to ask, needed to hear him say it, because the asking was its own kind of truth. A month passed. Late afternoon at the Beaufort Marina, and the light had that quality it only carried in the low season, amber and unhurried, turning the water to copper and the dock planks to gold. Sawyer sat on the edge of the pier with Emmy beside him, teaching her a bowline knot. His hands moved slowly, letting her follow each turn of the rope. She stuck her tongue out in concentration, the way her mother used to when she was threading a needle. Camille came down the dock road alone. No helicopter, no entourage. She was driving a 10-year-old sedan she had bought the previous week, a fact that had generated more discussion at Prescott Maritime headquarters than the quarterly earnings report. She carried a cardboard box under one arm. She set it on the dock beside Sawyer without explanation. He opened it. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a hand-built scale model of the Ruth Ann, every detail precise, from the faded blue hull paint to the crooked radio antenna to the coffee-stained name across the transom. Custom made. She had commissioned it from a model builder in Morehead City. It was the trawler he had been fixing the morning they met. Sawyer held the model in both hands and looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at her. He did not say anything, but his throat moved once, and his grip on the little ship tightened by a fraction. Emmy asked Camille if she wanted to learn how to tie a bowline. Camille sat down on the edge of the pier, her legs dangling above the water, her shoes flat-soled, practical, nothing like the heels she had worn the day she stepped off that helicopter, almost touching the surface. Emmy positioned herself between them, assuming the role of instructor with the seriousness of a junior officer running her first drill. She guided Camille's hands through the knot, correcting her loop placement twice, praising her final attempt with a solemn nod. 3 people on a dock, facing the bay. The water moved slowly beneath them. Camille told him she had renamed the yacht. The Prescott Sovereign was now the Raymond. Sawyer nodded. He understood what that meant, not as a corporate decision but as something far older and more private. A daughter putting her father's name on the thing he loved most, so it would still be spoken aloud on the water where he died. The quiet stretched. Emmy spotted a crab on the far piling and took off running, the bowline rope trailing behind her like a kite string. Camille and Sawyer sat side by side, watching the light change on the harbor. "You know," she said, her voice carrying no weight but its own, "most people would have swum away from that yacht." Sawyer looked out at the water. "Most people don't find what they're not looking for." She did not answer, but her shoulder shifted a slight lean toward him, just enough to feel, not enough to name. Neither of them had planned for this, not the truth beneath the water, not the silence that said more than any confession. But the tide had brought it all to shore, and neither of them was swimming away.